So, for sure, you know the other two guests who have already had brilliant talks today, Dave Snowden and Simon Wardley, and I'll let them introduce themselves again if you need. I'm not so well known. I don't have yet something on my name. So I'm quite perplexed that I find myself in such amazing company. So I'll tell you just a bit about myself so you can place me in the context of these things. I am somehow an architect, so that's a label which can mean many things. I have worked for the past 15 years in consulting and mostly in financial services because I live in London and this is what is happening in London. I somehow ended up being quite obsessive with this domain, quite passionate about it in the sense that I would like things to change, I would like things to get better. So I tend to go back all the time to this domain because this is my experience. It's not, of course, all my life, but this is my professional experience. Probably that's all for now about me. And I'll pass the microphone to my colleagues. I probably should say that we don't have a plan or a structure for this talk. So we expect to interact with you, hear your questions, and we are very keen to hear what you are interested in.
Okay, Dave Snowden. As I said this morning, I actually wear two hats. One is I'm director of the Kinevin Centre, which is a research institute which is now distributing itself around the world. That focuses on the application of natural science to social systems. That's what I talked about this morning. I also, on my third software startup, but the first I've done for myself as opposed for other companies. Yeah, and that's a Singapore-based headquartered company with a product called SenseMaker, which is also a mapping tool. So that's kind of like where I am and what I'm doing at the moment. Before that, probably the only person in the room who's been formally threatened with excommunication for heresy. I'm still quite proud of that. I was 98 on a list of 100 summoned to the Vatican in 1976. Because I'd written a paper which said Marxism, Catholicism and Hinduism were ontologically compatible and therefore could be combined, but were ontologically incompatible with capitalism and Protestantism, both of which were heresies. And I thought it was quite good, really. It got me into trouble, all right. The story of my life ever since has been a series of heresies over time.
Thank you. How do I follow that? So, my name's Simon Wardley. I'm a researcher for the Leading Edge Forum. I love maps, and so I talk about maps. Before I get started, I'm going to talk about Andra, because one of the things you probably don't know is you know where all the skeletons are buried in terms of the banking world. I mean, some truly... Am I not allowed to talk about that? Excellent, fantastic. So actually there's a wealth of stories here. And anybody from the finance industry? Ooh, oh, we can have a bit of fun today. So you know, this is, as we say, is an open space. So we have got no structure to this at all. I mean, we can talk about mapping, we can talk obviously about Kinevin, we can talk about the banking world, we can talk about the interconnections between the two. I suppose, actually, we should probably ask people, what do you want to talk about? What's your burning questions on this issue of strategy? Actually, one of the things I'd like to do is do a red card system, whereby basically if anybody gets really boring, you just see your labels. Can you just wave them like this? So if anybody gets boring, including us, if you wave them, one of us will throw the other off the stage and we'll grab you and put you on the stage as well. So that's the downside. So let me hear your questions, and what I'll do is I'll probably scribble up there.
Hello, my name is Sergey. I got actually two questions. They are about current trends in development. Because like, yeah, working here, you always hear, nowadays it's blockchain and machine learning.
Oh,
so everything is better with blockchain. Would be domain-driven design be better with blockchain? Yeah.
actually a song. And especially with blockchain. I'm sure that could be a hit.
Yeah, like yeah. So maybe storing events in distributed registers could work in some cases, but got no idea where. And the second question is about second buzzword is machine learning. So seems like to do some data analysis, there should be some big kind of domain expert, someone who can think about things like from the very high level. But at the moment, like software development and data science, data analysis are two different areas. Could domain-driven design be something that joins those two things? Because it feels like there is something in common there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me just repeat back to you, just because we'll collect I think, should we collect a load of questions and then we'll go through them? One is about future predictions. So that's things like blockchain, impact of blockchain, the next is machine learning. And I suppose to generalize that, it's how can we anticipate various forms of change and how they're going to impact us. And the other one is to do with software and data and the separation between those industries. Is that correct? And whether you see it coming together or... Is that a yes or a no?
Yes.
Okay, so whether domain-driven design can bring everything together in a happy family, yes? Okay. Interesting. Right, any other questions? Okay, we've got another one here at the front.
Yeah, you talked a bit about anthropology today. My girlfriend is an anthropologist and find it really hard to find a job. And I always say, well, we need more anthropologists in IT. What are your thoughts on that subject? All of you. Three, of course. Oh, really? Interesting.
So, just to paraphrase, anthropology, why can't we get jobs? Okay. Especially in IT. Okay. Yes, hang on.
Yeah. So Mr. Snowden talked about that. I think you have a lot of experience, and I can imagine that you mentioned that you have 3 startups already, software startups. So I'm thinking if, with your knowledge, every one of your startups just succeeds. So this is about success, right? And how we can apply those concepts that you mentioned. Are they can we apply them to startup companies, or we can only apply them to, conglomerates?
So just to confirm, because it's terrible translation, Mr. Snowden, do you have lots of experience, and what's your secrets of success? Is that roughly right? Startups and large corps, right? Okay, super.
Hello. So to me, domain-driven design, that's at least 50% business. But when I look around this conference here, I see 99% IT. So how do we, or how do you see a much closer strategic collaboration between IT and business? And what can we do practically to further that collaboration?
So basically design, domain-driven design, 90% business, but 90% of the attendants are IT. How do we bring them together? Things like, do we need diversity tickets for CEOs or something along those lines? Okay, any other questions? Right, so you've already asked one, haven't you? Yeah. Okay, so hang on a second, don't mean to be rude.
So I've attended Simon's workshop yesterday, and maybe some of you have seen the talks about the maps and well, strategic decisions you can make. I was interested in how the complexity framework, the Cynefin framework, actually could contribute to those strategic decisions.
The Cynefin maps are what we were doing last night. Yeah. So we already rehearsed that on table napkins, so that would be.
So that's basically Cynefin contribution to maps and strategic choices.
On top of the B as he does.
Yes.
That made my thinking much simpler.
Okay. I'll come to you afterwards, sir.
Yeah, small question. Where do I store my money? Because you know all the stories about the banks.
Yes. Where do I store? Yes. Okay, we're going to have a rule, as in, you know, a Chatham House. Well, okay, we'll give them code names. We'll have to. Yes. Right. Hello, sir.
Hi, I'm Pat. Simon, you kind of talked about the lean startup, that you don't like it. The book, sort of, on your talk a couple of hours ago. Oh, that was David, I'm sorry. But I attended Sidney Decker's talk a couple of hours ago, and he told us in order to learn anything of value, we just have to focus on the positives. In context was complex systems, adaptive capacity, and who's the fool? Who should I listen to? That's the question.
Right. So, who should I listen to?
See the end of multiply minus right? Always look on the bright side of life.
Okay. Right. So, other questions. Let's get this up to 15. Come on, we must have some more burning questions in here. Oh, right, one in the front.
I understood that mapping can be helpful, and but learning it might not be trivial. And so I wonder, from an organizational perspective, who should be able to write maps, who should be able to read maps, and how can I quicken the process of gaining the capability for both the readers and the writers?
Okay, so maps are helpful, potentially helpful, but not trivial. Who should write? Who should learn? This is like my How to Become Jimi Hendrix in 24 Hours guitar lesson book. Okay, so other questions? Oh, we got one right at the back. Hang on.
Sorry to make you one.
No, that's okay. It's.
How to deal with the disparity of reality and design?
Ooh. The disparity of reality. Was that disparity or despair? Disparity of reality and design. Okay. How to not run out of space on the board. Disparity of reality and design.
That's not an opportunity for design prize.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, Thomas. If it's not too personal, what may be your motivations in life?
Motivations?
Yeah, related to what you achieve, all of them.
Motivations in life, right. So you know why I teach people to map, don't you? Everybody knows, do they not know? Okay, motivations of life. So I'm on a crusade to destroy the entire consultancy industry because I hate them. Okay, hang on.
Hi there, I work in the finance industry and it's heavily regulated and there are lots of processes and I just want to learn the tactics, how to approach DDD, to learn in a highly regulated process-driven industry.
Okay, how to use DDD in a process-driven industry. Process-driven industry. I mean, some of these we're going to have to ask you, because I certainly don't know. Unless, right, a couple more. And I mean, the question is on the whole strategic sort of space as well, so.
Well, you didn't get to talk about Brexit in the last session. So, how would you map out Brexit?
Okay.
That will be number one.
Question 467, Brexit. Okay, we still have a few hundred questions to go. And we got two at the back here.
Yes, I found your concept of maps very interesting, but it was on a business level. And I was wondering if you can apply your maps on another abstraction on DDD, on designing a solution for a customer, on to know on which aspects you should concentrate first and on which aspects you should concentrate less.
That's a good question. Okay, so maps were very much on a business level. Can I use maps to help me describe what should be the solution? What should I focus on?
Yes.
Okay.
And to all three of you, should banks be worried about they being disrupted by new startups, for instance, or not? And should they?
So let me modify that slightly. Should banks be worried about open banking? Or do they find ways of pretending to be open banking without being banking? I'm actually a judge on the Nesta Open Banking competition, so I probably can't actually. Yeah, I know. By the way, one of the companies we put through was Teller. But anyway, so that's probably me in a lot of trouble. Teller provide an API which for open banking. Should banks be worried? Banks be worried about startups and open banking. Okay. Any final questions? Total silence in the room. Right, super. So we've got a huge mass of questions which we have to get through pretty quickly, otherwise I won't be able to read my writing by the time I get to the bottom, so dreadful it is. So, future predictions. Machine learning. Well, first, is there any one of these that we want to have a go at first, do you think?
I think it's probably easier to respond to several of them together. Why don't we each have a go at the lot and see what we come up with?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we're both looking at you, sir.
Let me get up and draw a couple of pictures, because that will make it easier.
Fantastic. Do you want the microphone?
I've got to use them. I hate these things. I'm not Tom Jones, sorry. A couple of things up front. One is the big employment in anthropology now is in medicine. Yeah, so the issue about patient journey, patient engagement, patients as subjects in their own destiny. And if you want some recommendations of reading on that, particularly the new work on assemblage theory in health, that's key. We're about to launch a major new program based on patient journey, looking at obesity reduction, hospital journey and mental health. And we've already done stuff on what are now 30,000 voices in Northern Ireland, in which the patients become the interpreters of their own experience rather than the subjects of other expert interpretation, right? So that's one of the big growth areas, and I'm going on to a meeting in Amsterdam about that on mental health this evening. Yeah? So that's the big area of growth in anthropology as well as HR. And to my mind, if HR would actually get people with some scientific background, that would kind of like be good news, all right? Because they're generally the most anally retentive control fetishists in any company, right? In terms of the way it works. So that's one area, right? I'm dealing with the small ones first. The issue about negative and positive stories. Do you tell your children when you take them to bed at night, assuming you still tell them stories, and you're not putting them in front of computer screens? Oh, by the way, if you want to know that, the neurological evidence is you shouldn't let them in front of a computer screen until they're 5. Yeah? Because you get irreparable or irreversible damage with excessive exposure to limited stimulation during that sort of period up until about 4 or 5. Right? So just be aware of that. You don't tell your children stories about how Janet and John stayed at home and did what Mummy and Daddy said and had a positive experience because they managed their family value system and achieved their KPIs, all right? You wouldn't get very far. You basically tell them stories about how Janet and John went into the woods despite Mummy's and Daddy's best advice, and they almost got eaten by wolves, swallowed by gypsies, yeah? It's a doom and disaster thing with a happy ending at the end because we want them to sleep at night, but we really want them scared shitless first, right? Now, all human storytelling traditions teach through failure, not through success. The human brain assimilates failure instantly, it may ignore success. Yeah, the stories which span around organisations are stories of failure, not success. And in pure complexity science terms, avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. Ethically, it also leaves more avenues open. If you tell people what you want them to do, you're making a decision. If you use your experience to say, don't do these things, but open up possibilities, you're in a better place. So when we do corporate culture, for example, we don't do goals, we do stories about what we don't want to be. And that's much more effective in terms of people's assimilation. And interestingly, spreading negative stories is more effective, but it leaves people open to involve in different ways, all right? So that would be the point. And say, I think a lot of people have totally corrupted appreciative inquiry. The original Coop Rider stuff was really interesting. Then it got industrialized into only positive stories legitimate, with facilitators deciding what story people can tell. Yeah, and I think that's completely unreasonable. You see, in the same thing on design thinking at the moment, it's one of the signs of the end of days, when something becomes industrialized. And so if you look what DDDEU have just done, they've now issued 2-day, 3-day courses with certificates, yeah? Yeah, they've reduced design into a linear process, yeah, based on formulaic recipes, when it needs to be an artisan capability. If anybody's interested in that, we're doing a 4-day session in Whistler coming up in a few months' time, where I'm working with Stanford University to create a complexity-based approach to design thinking, which is based on distributed ethnography and distributed ideation. A non-linear type approach, right? So that industrialization is a problem, which kind of leads me on to the thing I was sketching out last night, all right? So this is apex predator theory, if anybody knows that. You know? Okay, there's a wonderful, if you look at Trophic Cascade in Yellowstone, you'll see a wonderful little video when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, and the water quality improved. Because the wolves are the apex predator, you remove the apex predator, it creates a cascade of feeding changes, which means deer graze riverbanks because they're no longer being predated, so the riverbanks degenerate, water gets polluted. You just put one pack of wolves in place, everything gets itself solved. Right? So what happens with an apex predator is the ecosystem organizes around them. And to be quite honest, they tend to survive no matter how incompetent they are until the ecosystem is disrupted. So you see this when the meteor wipes out the Earth, the dinosaurs. It's not the crocodile or the shark who comes through as the next predator, it's the first mammal. Actually, it's a mammal-reptile mix. Because it's small, energy efficient and adaptive, so it can consolidate the new space. Okay? So if we look at it in terms of IT, I'll give this an illustration. 1920s, IBM repurposes punch card technology to dominate the hardware period. They then become an apex predator, and if anybody remembers those days, yeah, the phrase is nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Yeah, if you actually had better hardware, which virtually everybody did, and if you had better software, which everybody did, you still lost to the IBM salesman because nobody got fired for buying IBM. That's a classic apex predator. Now what then happened is hardware became a commodity, but because IBM was the apex predator, they were immunized from the effects of commodification until it was too late. This is actually Clayton Christensen's point about competence-induced failure. It's the fact you're the dominant predator, you're really very good at stuff, which means you don't see the signs that things are failing. Yeah? Because actually, hardware has become a commodity, which now that matters in software. Remember, IBM paid a guy called Bill Gates to write an operating system for them and let him keep the IP because they didn't think software was very important. And guess what? He repurposed that to create Microsoft. And Microsoft was then the dominant, apex predator for the next few decades. Everybody had to work with Microsoft. Yeah? And then software becomes a commodity. Microsoft don't see it because they're immunized. And Apple come in left field with Next. This is my one contribution to the history of IT. I was negotiating with Next to take it on board for a consortium of European companies. It's the only time I've met Steve Jobs, all right? So this is Next. We're going to use it as the it's effectively our development language. It's its first real object-oriented language. It was brilliant. And this is a multi-million-dollar deal. It's going to save Next. Next actually goes bankrupt because they didn't sign the deal. The reason they didn't sign the deal is they asked me for an escrow, but they refused an escrow clause. Anybody remember escrow? Yeah, you put the source code into storage, and nobody ever did it, but we just all signed contracts to say we would, all right? And I thought they were negotiating this as a sort of, making something matter that doesn't matter, so when you concede it, you get something at the end. If you don't know that trick, it's a standard negotiating one. So I ended up saying, look, we can't do a deal without this, at which point they said, we'll have to ask Steve. Up until that time, Steve Jobs was considered incompetent in business terms, so we were told he was nothing to do with the business. We now discovered he controlled it. So he comes in and says, why do you want escrow? And I explained why, and he said, would you ask this of Microsoft? And I made the fatal mistake of saying, I don't need to. At which point a pile of books got thrown at me. All the invective you read in the biography I experienced at first hand. They refused to sign the contract, and actually I now claim, as a result of which Next became OS, all right? So I'm claiming the credit for that. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, right? But the point is, the reason Apple could move in so quickly is they created what anthropologists call objects of material design. They realized hardware and software were irrelevant. What mattered is something beautiful which did something you didn't know you needed. Yeah, and techies hate Apple because they like things like Android. I hate Android. I'm seriously thinking of stopping developing software for Android because it takes me 25 times as much to support it, 5 times as much to develop it for iOS. It may be cheaper to ship devices. Yeah, because there are too many versions of microcontrol. So what you see is hardware, software, object fashion. Now, well, the way that works, is everyone knows Moore's crossing the chasm? Okay. So what you do is you get this early, you get this early adopter phase, and then you get a late majority phase. So I'm combining this with S-curves. So basically what happens is this is 2.5% of the market. And this, by the way, this is critical if you're going to get ideas adopted in companies, because the same applies. There's always a market for something completely novel. It's generally about 2.5%. It's the people who like things because they're new. They actually like them to go wrong. We learned that in hardware. They want to know how it does it. And they don't mind if it goes wrong because they can do it better than you anyway. That's the problem you get when you sell software in that space. Then over here, this is early majority. This is kind of like 13.5%. And if you can control that space, you win. Right? After that, everybody comes. So if you take a standard life cycle curve, it looks like that. What Moore did is to say, actually, it doesn't. What you've got is this chasm between those two phases. So basically, people don't buy here until this stuff is fully proven. And you make the mistake of projecting your sales like this, it ain't going to happen. And that was brilliant insight. It's really important because these guys buy on how it does it. These guys buy on what it will do for me. Right? Now, that's actually key if you're trying to sell a new method as well. It's exactly the same principle. So either way, what we did is say actually that what it looks like is the reason that chasm is there is because the previous idea is dominant and it's about to die. Right? So remember IBM, Microsoft? The old idea is reaching the end of its utility, so there's space for something new. Yeah? But the very fact that it's so strong makes it difficult for the new thing to get traction beyond that phase. Yeah? If you spot it here, you survive. If you spot it here, that's the Clayton Christensen point. That's where it's too late. You now drop down here, which is what happened to IBM. Yeah, so you lose the apex predator concept. Right? This is my equivalent of Simon's Wardley maps, and there's links in it. Right? The key thing is to understand where you are, because if you're here, you basically serve the dominant predator. You can call it a hyena strategy if you want. Yeah? As you get increasing commodification, and this will bring me on to Brexit, as you get increasing commodification, i.e. the political environment gets homogenized, so there's very little to choose between the different offerings, and this is where the banks are as well at the moment. Yeah, and I'm dealing with several of the questions at once. Homogenization and commodification means you're entering this phase. At that point, you need a lot of novel stuff to move in fast. And if you don't do it, you're dead. Okay? So what actually happens with Brexit, it happens with Trump, it happened identically in the Weimar Republic. If you study the Weimar Republic, it's scarily similar. Is there's no difference between the dominant political parties. They've homogenized on the center. That means extremist, highly energy efficient, small groups start to come through. One of them will almost certainly succeed. Yeah, at the time of the Weimar Republic, there were about 15 extreme right groups, 20 extreme left groups. The Junker class decided Hitler was more controllable, so they supported him. Yeah? Now just think about that. That's what happened with Brexit. You've got neoliberal homogenization, which you also had in the States. Nobody can see any real difference between dominant political parties. That means we get despair, nothing can change. You get extremism. Yeah? And by the way, Brexit ain't going to happen. I mean, everybody I know in Whitehall is just waiting for people to realise that it's just a matter of waiting, because it's impossible to make it happen. It's just crazy, right? Okay, so pick it up in I'll leave that because that's very important. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at products. This is the new stuff we're doing on strategy. Because the other thing is what happens is when you reach this point, the distribution of events moves from a Gaussian distribution to a Pareto distribution. And that's actually really important because in a Gaussian distribution, you work into the center of a bell curve. When the actual distribution of events starts to become Pareto, it means the things in the tails of the distribution become more important. But you're continuing to ignore them because you think you're focused on the center. And that's why I talked this morning about outlier detection. Okay? So hitting off some of the others on that, I think banks have got a real problem. Because you can't distinguish between them. Yeah, there's absolutely no distinction. And they used to have service. I mean, I had the experience 2 days ago, I forgot to transfer money from Singapore, so I got an automatic thing with, we're not going to honour your payments. Now, the way it used to work is my bank manager used to phone me up, because I've been in the same branch of the same bank since I was 17. Right? I've never not paid a debt back in my life. He'd phone up and say, can you get some money in? I've extended your overdraft. When this happened to me 2 years ago, I phoned them up and said, oh, we've got to go into a process and you work for yourself, so it might not get through, it might affect your credit score. So I've now got a network of people, we help each other out with short-term loans, completely independent of the banking system. Yeah? Because actually they've moved into this is the point I was making this morning, they've moved into a process-based approach in which what they're actually doing is everything is about the center of a distribution with no exceptions allowed. Yeah? And to my mind, the future of banking is to repersonalize the service, yeah? Particularly with high net worth and those sort of areas. So there's lots of stuff around that. Positive stories, mapping. This, by the way, Cynefin is a way of deciding what sort of approach you should use. Okay? So if in this space, and I'll come back to software development, one of the reasons I've had 3 successful software startups is I didn't go down a lean startup route. What I actually had is a portfolio of interesting things that we played with, and the things which sold, we then invested in. And that's been a principle for me ever since. If you can't sell something, you shouldn't make it. Yeah? This stage here is sell to make. Because there's always people in that with money who will give you money for things they find interesting. And if you haven't got people like that, the market isn't ready yet. The key thing here is to switch over to make to sell. Because now people are buying functionality. And that's kind of like the reason I've had 3 successes. Not because I tried several things and some failed, but I kept my options open for as long as possible over a diverse range, and I allowed the market to determine what was going to be successful or unsuccessful, and then only invested once we had the thing stable. So I actually wanted to make that sort of move. My motivation? Well, let's come on to the AI thing, and then I'll finish off with motivation. So I just did this big think tank in California on existential threats. And the order of existential, just to say there were Nobel Prize winning scientists in this group, this is a serious group, all right? The order is nuclear war, artificial intelligence, gene splicing, global warming. Right? That's the sequence, all right? Global warming is the 4th most scary out of that. And our current conclusion is we've got between 13 and 36 years to change the way we govern society, or it will be too late. Right? And I'm prepared to defend that and go through the process, all right? Because actually governance is the issue. It's not that we don't know the solutions, but there's no governance mechanism, and you can see what's happening with Trump, with Brexit, is a complete focus on irrelevancies when there are more significant things in play. And that's actually dangerous. The reason AI is such a danger is 2 things. First of all, it's a joke I made this morning. At the moment, we're planning to meet AI halfway. Human beings are forced to follow rigid processes, and they're forced to achieve defined objectives. Education has become information retrieval through a screen rather than through an educational process. And I'm very sorry, AI is better at that than us. And just to really scare you, anybody know about epigenetics? Okay, one of the most important things coming out of biology. If you give bright mice the children of dumb mice to raise, the children of the dumb mice are bright. I'll repeat that because the implications are huge. If you take mice who've learned to solve problems, and you give them the children of mice who haven't lived to solve problems to raise, it's short lifespan, then basically the children of the dumb mice are bright. We now know that culture inherits, and we know the mechanism. Culture changes the chemical structure, which changes the alleles and RNA, and that's inherited. So if you live in an environment without intellectual stimulation in an impoverished world, then after a couple of generations you've got a biological problem, not a sociological problem. Right? And by actually reducing ourselves for rigid processes of information, we may be making biological changes to the species which make AI actually more able to cope with us. The other problem is the black box issue, is we're handing more and more problems over to AI, yet without actually thinking about the implications, without traceability, without ethics, and then get me onto AI-controlled warfare, which is so scary, I really don't want to be told about it anymore. We actually went through the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. If we had the current command technology, the world wouldn't exist anymore. Because there's not enough human buffering in the system to provide control. So the big program I'm running at the moment, which is my passion, is to get every child in every school in the world to become a journalist to their own community on a monthly basis. Right? After Brexit, after Trump, we got serious. We're doing this in Wales at the moment. You don't know, Wales has a thing called the Future Generations Act. First country in the world to do this. No legislation can be passed unless it explicitly takes account of the needs of the next generation. And there's a commissioner to enforce that. The dean of the school at the university is the minister who actually put that in place. What we're doing is we're getting children to capture the day-to-day stories of people's reality on a distributed ethnographic basis and replace policy formation by distributed intelligence, but with human buffering in the system and human interpretation. Because the trouble with social media at the moment is the feedback loops are too fast. If a feedback loop is too fast, the system becomes perverted very quickly. You need buffers in the feedback, and this is just basic biology and basic engineering, to be honest. You need buffering in the system, and that's why we put human agency in place. So that's my big goal at the moment, is to actually take that from an experiment in Wales, Trondheim and Austin, and make that a worldwide process so we can actually use computers to augment human intelligence and not to replace it, which is the way we're going at the moment. So that will be my take on those questions.
Okay, Josh, fantastic. Right, this is me in technology. Oh, excellent, I can just move up and down, it gives me a new page. Right, so in order to answer some of those questions, I suppose I'm going to have to answer 3 other questions. One is on evolution itself, another one is on the concept of disruption, and the third one is on the concept of ecosystems. And then I can hopefully use this combined together to explain some sort of answers. I'm looking very hopeful. Right, so I'm going to start with evolution itself. Quite some time ago, so this was back when I started with mapping, the origin was I started off with an anchor, the user need, and then basically created a value chain. And so I had position, but I needed to find a way of mapping change itself. And I started off actually with Everett Rogers' work. Oh, you hear me breathing? Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll hold it here. Is that better? Oh, it was me going like this. Oh, no, sorry, apologies. Right. So I started with actually Everett Rogers' work. So if I look at adoption over time, which was made famous by Geoffrey Moore, so he looks at the adoption rate. It's not me, it's actually the builders outside. Over time. So the adoption rate over time looks like something like that. Sorry for my lousy drawing. And is it me? Geoffrey Moore talks about the chasm, which we've heard about. And the cumulative form looks like that is a really lousy S-curve, but it sort of looks like that. And what you've got is early adopters to laggards, etc. Now what I'd noticed was there was this pattern where we started off with the genesis of new ideas, we seemed to get custom-built examples, and then it would go to products, and then it would go to sort of commodity. And I thought this is going to be really simple, because obviously I just need to find the percentage adoption at which that happens. So like early adopters, obviously Genesis, and then it would go, say, somewhere here, would be custom built, and then you get products, and then it would be commodity. That's where I started. I thought this is going to be really simple. It's going to take me 5 minutes to do this. So quick question, who has a smartphone here? Okay, pretty much everyone. Who thinks it's a commodity? Some of you, about half of you, right. Okay, gold bars, do you reckon they're pretty standardized commodity? Gold bars?
Gold bar.
You do not think gold bars are a standardized commodity? Right, who works in finance? Banking. Would you say gold bars are pretty much a standardized commodity? What gold bars? Gold, you know, bars. I've got the ones which come with stamped in labels and quality and all the rest of it, and size and dimension, and we pile them up in huge numbers. Right, so let me ask that a question again, just in case it was my language. Gold bars. Who thinks they are a fairly standardized commodity in the banking world? Wow. Really? Who owns one? All right. Almost nobody. Okay. So actually, gold bars are highly standardized. I mean, we have we have entire commodity markets built around it. Just for those of you who didn't know. But the problem was, it didn't matter what I looked at. Sometimes things would become a commodity when like 1% of the population had it, and sometimes things wouldn't be a commodity when 99% of the population had it. The problem was there was no correlation between how adopted something was and whether it became a commodity or not. And that was the first problem I hit. And I was like, at this point, this was 2005, I was like, oh, this is disaster.
Simon, could you define the word commodity as you're using it?
Okay, so I took commodity as being something which is standardized, well-defined, well understood, and there's general agreement for those people who are using it that it was a commodity. So a lot of the publications and books would talk about it as being a commodity. I later refined that with a whole set of characteristics, which I can show you. So I was struggling, and then I realized that what happens is actually you get diffusion of something, like the first ever telephone, and then you get diffusion of a slightly better telephone, and diffusion of a better telephone, and diffusion of a better telephone. And they all go to 100% adoption of their applicable market. But their applicable markets are different. And this was time. So what we had was multiple diffusion curves. The first phone would come along, you get to 100% of its applicable market, be replaced by something else, be replaced by something else, be replaced by something else. Now the problem was, this might be a custom-built example, this might be a product, this might be a product, this could be a product. I don't know whether the next cycle, or the next cycle, or the next cycle, whether it's going to be a product, or it's going to be a commodity, or what it's going to be. So again, I was stuck. So I was in the British Library, and I was thinking about this problem, and I started reading publications, and I had this publication which was written many, many years ago, which was all about how to use a telephone. And it described how you should pick up the telephone, how you should hold it, how you should speak into the telephone. And then I saw other publications which were talking about things, how to use a light switch. There's a wonderful little poster of this sign which basically says, you know, this is equipped with Edison light bulbs. Don't attempt to light with a match. Use the switch on the door. And I thought, well, why don't we have those signs anymore? Because the use of something has somehow become embedded in social knowledge. So I started to look at the frequency of publications. And what I found was publications seem to follow a particular path. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, Stage 4. That is definitely not me. So, the first set of publications talked about the wonder, like the wonder of radio. Then they talked about building, construction, and awareness, how to build your own radio crystal sets. Then they talked about how basically my radio is better or worse than your radio, so it's all about feature differentiation, operation, maintenance. And finally, they just talk about use, the radio times. So what I did was, looking at a huge number of different activities, I defined this point, basically, as a point of certainty. That we'll stop worrying about it, we're now just worrying about use. And I found the time for different activities, and I went back, and found that time for whatever that activity was, and found the applicable market, and I called that ubiquitous, 100% ubiquitous. And then I plotted ubiquity versus certainty for different activities. It's about 9,000 total. Whoops. And this came up. And then I overlaid those stages. Stage 1, 2, 3, 4. Genesis, custom built, product, commodity. Now, because I have the publication types, I was able to produce a huge list of characteristics which are actually published on a cheat sheet for trying to define the stage of evolution of something. So ubiquity, certainty, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, or Genesis, custom built, product, commodity.
I have a question now.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the smartphone and plot it in these two publication phases and this S-curve? Bottom one.
We can. I put the smartphone. We can do it, except for the fact I've got these other bits to get through just to get to that question. But then we could. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So this created the evolution axis at the bottom here. So Genesis, custom built, product, commodity, and then you've got the value chain. So what you would find is something would come along and it would evolve, become a commodity, and it would enable higher order systems to appear. So you started to discover these patterns. And sometimes you would get multiple components coming along. So for example, you would get, not me, the internet, you might get the phone, you might get something else like a digital camera now. Cameras become a commodity, and those would be combined together to create the smartphone. So the smartphone is basically a combination of multiple underlying components. And of course, that all industrializes as well. So, a couple of things I noticed. Let's talk about disruption now. The evolution of something can be thousands of diffusion curves. You go from here to here to here, each of these with their own chasms. Genesis, custom built, product, commodity. A couple of things. One, we have inertia to each of these changes. The inertia builds up. So basically in the product phase, it's much bigger than it is in the custom built to product, much bigger than the Genesis to custom built. So if you are in this position, you have inertia to that change. Equally, if you're in this position, you have inertia to that change. So we have inertia. The second thing is, when we have product to product substitution, we can't actually anticipate that. So when a product moves and becomes a more evolved product, we don't know, we can't anticipate when or what's going to be included. So you can get disruption in this phase, which is unpredictable. But we can anticipate that any product will move to a commodity or a utility phase. And at this point, this is predictable. And we know that past companies will get stuck behind inertia barriers and disrupted. So what we have are two different forms of disruption. One which is predictable, one which isn't. So now, the final bit is just ecosystems. There are many ways of playing this game. And one of them is a particular ecosystem model known as ILC. So you've got Genesis, custom built, product, commodity. If you take a product and shift it to a commodity, and you enable other people to build on top, what I can do by exposing this as an API is mine the metadata. So if I build compute as a utility, and you all build things on top, suppose you two are doing big data, and everybody else is doing kit and internet, just by looking at the consumption of my service, not your data, I can spot they're growing and you're not. So what you can do is use people building on top of you as a future sensing engine. You can mine the metadata to find new patterns which you then commoditize to new component services, and then just repeat the pattern. So you get everybody else to innovate for you, you leverage all the metadata to spot future patterns, which you commoditize to new component services. And what happens is you are constantly building a stack of component services which people are building on top. And every time you do this, somebody's going to moan that you've eaten their business model. But the net effect is, if you're in the middle, and you've got this big ecosystem of companies building around you, then your rate of innovation, your customer focus, and your efficiency all now simultaneously increase with the size of the ecosystem. Does anybody know of a company which is increasing in rate of innovation, efficiency, and customer focus, and people keep on saying they've eaten my business model? Okay? That particular company is, if you think they're hard today, they're going to be much harder 5 years from now. So the point about this is that when we talk about evolution, there are multiple diffusion curves within evolution and multiple chasms to cross. The second point is that when you look at a map, there are two different forms of disruption. One which is unpredictable, one which is predictable. So product you can't predict, product to utility, you can at least, you know it's going to happen, you can plan for it. And the third, there is ways of building ecosystems, particular models like ILC, whereby you get everybody else to play the game for you in terms of innovating new stuff, and simply sit there mining metadata, which you then commoditize to new components. Now that means, and this links back to the apex predator bit, in this space, you always want to be the first mover to industrialize a component and build that ecosystem. You always want to be the fast follower to anything which is novel and new. Ideally, you want to get everybody else to do it for you. And the best way of doing that is to ban innovation in your organization. And the best way I know of doing that is to introduce something called the press release process. Have you heard of the press release process? Before you start a project, you have to write the press release. Right. Let's think of something genuinely novel and new, never invented before. Can anybody think of something genuinely novel and new? Yes?
Underwater jetpack.
Underwater jetpack. Is that a genuinely novel and new thing? Right. Could you write the press release for that? No. We don't even know what it would look like. We don't even know it would work. The point about the press release process is it kills off the ability, it forces everybody to take pre-existing apps and industrialize them. So let's go and answer, in my sense, some of these questions. The first one is machine learning and predictions. Sorry if I'm running a bit long here. If I take, well, it's context specific. So if I take something like the automotive industry, and we start from the point of users want to get from A to B, they also want to do so safely. That requires a whole bunch of underlying components, and as you go down the components, you see things like AI and machine learning. So what we know are the boring stuff. The boring stuff is that machine learning in terms of automotive industries will spread and we'll get self-driving cars, and that will impact transportation systems, and for the DVLA, we won't need to be licensing people, which is a big hit for government because we lose licensing revenue. The interesting stuff is the unintended stuff. So we also know in this new world that people want to create difference or status. And the problem is you can't create status if the cars are all commodity and all of this stuff has evolved. So what people will create status in is route management. So we're going to have digital subscription models. So we know in government, we already know people are going to have platinum, gold and silver memberships to pools of self-driving cars. And if you're all silver members and you're a platinum member, when you get in your car, everybody else's car will get out of the way so you can drive past. And isn't that wonderful? Except when we have a flood, in which case you're the only person who gets out, and we're all stuck, waiting for these self-driving cars to turn up, which are ferrying out all the platinum members. So in terms of the machine learning stuff, I mean, there's all sorts of impacts that we can anticipate by looking at the value chain and how it's going to industrialize. But there's also a lot of unintended consequences, which government, we can anticipate some of them, like some of the issues to do with social mobility or social inequality being embedded into our transportation systems. The next one is mapping, helpful but not trivial. I've shown you 3 parts of mapping: evolution, basically inertia and 2 different forms of disruption, and simple models of how to use ecosystems. They are a small fraction of the entire field of mapping. I'm afraid mapping isn't trivial. It is a process which takes time and effort to learn those practices. Eventually, we hope mapping will be automated, as in somebody else will do it, and so we don't have to do it. Of course, by then we'll be learning new practices and new context-specific forms of play. The next one, Sullivan, contribution to maps and strategic choices. What Dave's talking about in terms of the apex predator is very, very similar, I believe, and Dave, you can tell me if I'm wrong, to this transition here, particularly the shift from product to commodity. And this is probably one of the most crucial shifts there are, and it's also one of the ones you can anticipate. So I sat in the boardrooms of IBM, HP and Dell in 2008 and told them they were going to lose their entire hardware industry to Amazon. And the response was, we'll get to that when we need to, because they had all this inertia from their past successful business model. And of course, they have lost that industry. I mean, some people are still in denial, but this is now going to go on with serverless. And I'm afraid serverless is not just hardware, that's the entire software industry, all of it, that Amazon's going for. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do software. We'll do more software than ever before. But we'll be building higher order systems on top of those components. The next one, disparity, who should listen to, store my money, okay, secrets of success, large corporates. So one of the things with mapping, I'm afraid, is once you start mapping, you basically find patterns that are 3 different forms. Climatic, which you can't change. They just happen to you. That's things like, this stuff will evolve if there's supply and demand competition. You find doctrine, which are things you can decide to do or not, but they tend to be universally useful. So that's things like focusing on user needs, removing duplication where possible, building in small components. These things tend to be generally useful. You also find context specific. So for example, open source is really good for driving things to more of a commodity. But it makes no difference over here in the Genesis phase, whether it's proprietary or open source. What open source does is it drives things to the right. Now the problem is, if you can't see the environment, it's very difficult to distinguish which one of these 3 something is. So you find a pattern and you go, well, this seems to work in this space. It might be context specific rather than universally useful. So that's quite common, okay? So in terms of the secrets of success, there seem to be some obvious ones, like removing duplication and so forth. They seem to be universally useful. In terms of, let's have a look, maps. What was this? I told you I should have read this one beforehand. What should we concentrate on? Okay, I can't read my handwriting there. So this one, should banks be worried about open banking? Well, again, if you map out, it's pretty much like the insurance industry. If you start from the point of view of the user and what they need, and map out the insurance industry, you'll quickly discover that almost all of it's commodity components. So why isn't the insurance industry being taken out? Why isn't the banking industry being taken out? Well, mainly it's because we use regulation as a barrier to entry. So the insurance industries were we started off trying to reduce regulation because the regulators are a user. And of course, once they realized that their entire value chain is basically commodities, they turned around and went, well, what we need is more regulation. And the reason why they do that is not because of your interest, it's to protect their own interests. So I suppose to wrap it up from my point of view, starting with mapping, there's a couple of things. We start off with concept of evolution, which comes from diffusion curves. When we start looking at that, we discover that multiple diffusion curves make up this evolution curve, which is the fundamental x-axis of movement on a map. Once you start doing that, you can actually use these different publications to define the characteristics of actually what makes a commodity, what makes a product. And there's something called the cheat sheet, which has about 20, 30 layers of characteristics which define that. The second thing you discover is that as things evolve, there are two different forms of disruption. One is predictable, one is unpredictable. The unpredictable is the product to product, the more predictable is the product to commodity. Unfortunately, because we don't visualize the environment, most of us don't anticipate that. If you do understand that, then there are these ecosystem games like IRC, which you can use to exploit. So you always want to be a first mover to industrialize, but being a fast follower to the novel and new. And why do I do this? What is my purpose? My purpose is, quite simply, I don't like management consultants. The people who can actually map are people within the industry, people working for companies. All of this stuff should be Creative Commons. Most of what I see from management consultants is outcome bias, secrets of success, authoritative bias. There is very little substance to most of the books that I read. So I found this useful, and I was using it, and then about 7 years after I was using it, I discovered that not many other people seem to be mapping. And so that's what I do. I teach people how to map. It's all Creative Commons, you help yourself. And if you can annihilate the entire management consultancy industry, I would personally be very happy. So that's mine. Sorry for the wander.
I'll take the pen soon, but I thought I'll give you a little break and I'll tell you a story somehow related to one of those questions. So I worked in consulting. I'm happy that nobody killed me until now. But usually doing things. So I left consulting, I left banking, and I'm now focusing on research and an unusual type of research because I'm interested in banking, but I'm doing research in an institute for the science of cities. And there is a reason for that. I had some questions after 20 years in consulting or working with many companies, and I didn't feel that staying in the field will help me give an answer, because we are clustered in organization, and there are people more or less like us, not identical, but we work with, we use a certain language to understand each other, we talk about the same systems, and so on. And I am interested in complexity, and I do think that financial services is a complex system. Why I think it's complex? Because at the moment it has a global scale, yeah? So when something happens, everybody on earth, it's affected. I met people who, from Philippines, working in Australia, who told me how they had been affected by Brexit, which I didn't think it was really possible, or it was possible so fast. But also, when we talk about complex systems, usually we talk about, or we think about natural systems. And natural systems don't destroy each other. Yeah? So they balance somehow. Yeah? So there is not one natural system which is completely rigid and doesn't take the consequences of what it's doing. Financial services, though, as an industry, even if it has global reach and it has massive implication in social and political, doesn't take the consequences. Yeah, it creates massive ripples in the rest of the world, and nothing happened to it. And I don't think it's sustainable. I think it's really dangerous. So then, because I know the system from inside, I know how it's made of, I started decomposing it without realizing that this is already happening. I don't need necessarily to think about it. This is happening, but you have to spot the pattern. And some of the components of financial services, which are now residing only in the banks, and this is only for the purpose, for the reason that banking is regulated, have characteristics which fit normally infrastructure and networks. So the way they are contained at the moment in those institutions create massive distortions in the world, and create this world that we look at. While I do my research, I also do consulting, not as much as before, and I have different sort of questions, and I don't have a team behind me. It's just me going and advising some angry people, as Dave mentioned. So usually when I meet them, sometimes they are at the end of their patience. And last year I had a client, financed probably with too much money, or I don't know. So I thought, so the question I received last year was all the time, can you help us build a bank? How to build a bank? We want to build a bank. So this guy wanted to build a bank, had the money to build a bank. I discussed for a number of weeks with his team, understanding what they want to do, what market they want to attract, what they're after, how fast they want to go, and so on and so on. So as an architect, I came up with 10 principles, not theoretics. They were just very simple rules, very simply expressed. And I was trying to explain them, look, this is like a filter. Whatever decision you take in order to get to that point that you have in mind, you filter that decision through this test, through these 10 principles. If one of them doesn't stand, you don't get where you want to go. And I thought it's simple, or it's safe, and so on. Instead, the guy got angry and he said, 10 principles? I give you 20. I was like, okay, write down. And I was like, okay. And he said, data is a new oil. At each point I said, can you ask your secretary to write them down, because, just to be sure that we are capturing them. What I want to tell you with this type of expressions data is a new oil, have some machine learning with it, put some blockchain. Some of those were also in his 20 principles, were there. Brexit is Brexit. These are catchy words, and for many people, somehow give them comfort or safety. And there will be many words, and in my career I've met I don't know how many other words. So take them.
Yes. You want to shout?
I'll try,
I'll get you a
but I don't have a very strong voice.
You phone your microphone.
Can you hear me at the back? I can go in the middle. So, if you have any real questions, so you are in a domain and you think maybe we need something like that, go and talk with people who do machine learning. There are so many other people talking about it in this, kind of propaganda kind of way, which will not help your understanding, and in general, it doesn't help the industry, doesn't help machine learning professionals or blockchain professionals. Other questions. Probably I should talk a bit about banking and complexity, because this is my domain, and I will put a bit of open banking in it, even if this is something I intend to talk about tomorrow. But the subject is so large that I think I can give you some nuggets now, especially related to what Simon and David have spoken about. So banking as a domain is very large, and there are many financial institutions, types of financial institutions. When we talk about open banking in this term, we refer to retail banking such. The focus is very much on the customer in open banking, and the domain which is touched from the banking world is just the visible part of banking. I call it the visible part of banking. It's not a formal name, but that visible part of banking is just 10% of what the bank is. So there is a tendency to think about banking like it serves some customer needs, but I also look from the other perspective, what it takes to obtain a banking license. What makes an institution a bank? The question is not, do you have customers? This doesn't matter. The bank has to be able to aggregate and distribute credit. That's the function of the bank, of a retail bank in society, to distribute credit. In order to do this, the bank acts as an agent on a market. The market is very much hidden to us as a group of normal people, yeah. And you cannot access it without that license, without being a licensed bank. To me, the problem of where the banks go and how they evolve is very much linked to how they present themselves as an agent on the market. And nobody looks there. I don't know why. Because really we're talking about our lives and our money. So in UK, for example, we have 4 big banks, and they share the market equally. Each of them has 25% of the population in UK. So their balance sheet, what they are hedging every day is this, the money of the 25% of the population in UK. If you look how they do this though, what systems we have in place, what information we have, how fast we have it, and so on, they actually act in the dark. And this is, and this is not an unknown fact. It's not just me who observed this, just by being in this bank. Everybody knows it. And just a small error around there can make that bank break or fail, especially in times of crisis. So why we don't hear, about these things? Because
they go on that line. They predict, they think today, tomorrow it will be like today. And based on that, without having the data about their own institution, without having the information, they go and do more or less the same thing. Nothing happens to your balance sheet when you have the same market share of the same population of the same country in stable conditions. However, when you have a crisis and things are changing real time, I can tell you, banks don't see that. Don't see it. They see it with delay, and whatever they are doing until they see the real thing, it's a gamble. This is where I see the real problem in banking, even in retail. It's true that a lot of energy is focusing at the moment on the top, on the open banking part. However, the movement is important. So now I'll start drawing. So if I were to simplify how a bank looks like, I will split it in 3 parts. So there is not a theory about this. That's my way of explaining sometimes how this works. Every bank I have seen has over 3,000 systems. Some of them have 20,000, some of them have more than that. Very few have an understanding of how these things are connected and related, and it's true the human mind cannot comprehend the whole of it. Banks used to have people who were experts in parts of the landscape, but through the fabulous outsourcing badly done, they lost this type of knowledge. And this is one of the most dramatic things that has happened in banking, losing the knowledge of people who were holding all these things together. Every single failure that we have seen in retail banking in UK, which made it into the news, was exactly something like that. A tiny error, something that somebody with a bit of knowledge about those systems could have fixed in a decent time so the market would not observe. When the attrition rate is so high in a system which holds itself with tape, such error surface, and we know about them. So these 3 parts, each of them contains hundreds and thousands of systems. I would say that in this part, which I call it the visible part, okay, let's say, we have probably 10% of the system. And underneath, in this part, we have 90% of the system and 90% of the costs. B and C. So what do we have in A? So we have the history of interaction with the customer. So we have initially the branch and all the equipment required there. We have the ATMs. We have the telephony and telephony centers. We have the online banking, and we have the mobile banking. And these things have evolved, but the banks never considered them as strategic changes. It was like, let's add this thing over the top of what we had. This is where open banking comes into the story. So all these things are called channels in banking, and there was an entire management consulting branch offering advice on how to make your bank omni-channel, basically. So one channel will be aware that you started something in another channel and so on. No bank I know is omni-channel in any way. So this is where open banking appears, and what this means for banks, it means that the next sales channel will not belong to you. It will be somebody else, and actually that somebody else will be a sub-industry, and there is an infinite number of possibilities on how this will go and how it will evolve. What do we have underneath this? Underneath this, in general, we have what I call transaction system,
And in banking, usually they're called core banking systems. Every single bank I've seen has over 30 of them. And some of them are over 45 years old. The problem is not the age as such. They live on, let's say, the most recent version of mainframe. Yes?
Is by any chance any of the systems run by C composed by I-series systems by IBM?
Yes. Nice. Yes, why not? But that's not a bad. That's not a bad thing. I'm a former IBMer, so yeah. Yeah, there are still things I hold dear about the company. It's not the worst thing, I tell you. They are still working, and when they wouldn't work, the problem is that the banks have nothing in place. Yeah. So the problem is not the age. As you know, because many of you are software developers, software reflects the reality. Yeah. So simply the reality of doing a transaction 45 years ago was very different than now. Yeah. So. These systems at the moment are capable to capture the timestamp and very few bits about the transaction, but the rest had to live somewhere else in other systems that flourished around core banking. So not only that here you have 30 or 70 systems, each of them is surrounded by probably other hundreds of systems, which together give you the impression that you have a full transaction to the richness that you have it today. Yeah?
Do you find Excel as an application?
Oh, everywhere.
Because I've been in banking.
Yes, everywhere. Yeah, everywhere. And I can tell you a lot about that, unfortunately. No, okay. So the reason why I tell you this is because open banking, so it doesn't matter what application you come up with, it could be needed, really needed by the customers. It feeds on the data which lives in these systems. Yeah, so it needs to be put together in order to be served to you. I work a lot with startups, and they come up with a lot of ideas and so on, and my usual question, or the way I help them, is to figure out where their startup would plug into the banking world. And the thing I come across the most is the illusion that the bank has this data, you know, a beautiful transaction, like the fact that you did it on your mobile, this is your IP, you were at this location, and so on. The reality is that there is a lot of fuzzy matching between bits of transaction in order to serve this impression, plus a lot of other things, but I would not bore you with it. All I want to say is that the ground is shaky, you know, so it's very difficult to build a beautiful, or not a beautiful, because it's not about beauty, it's about something that people need to use, you know, they need the context of the transaction in order to make sense or it or whatever. It's very difficult to deliver. It's something so simple, but is for whatever reasons is not solved. The approach to open banking, if it would have been a strategic approach from the banks, probably they should have sat down and said, you know guys, our sales channel is going. We used to make money, you know, our cost per transaction is huge, yeah? We have to support now, through the regulation, all these startups or companies connecting to us. We cannot pass this cost. We are also by law responsible for the transactions and so on. Let's think how we solve this longer term. What happened, in fact, was not that. It's another system appeared alongside this core banking system, usually huge real-time databases. Transactions were shuffled into this, and from there, they give the impression that they serve you the data through the API. So it's still not fixed. The area I was talking about, which I think is the most worrying one, it's even under the core banking system. So it's this area, C. Yeah? Very often, when I talk with people in the industry, And doesn't matter what the question is. Sometimes I refer to what is underneath core banking, and people are like, but there is something under core banking, and these are people working in the industry. What is under core banking? It's scary, actually, because this is also the way the bank manages the aggregate of this data, and how usually you manage this. It's a domain which is incredibly regulated. So you have finance accounting with all the regulations, you have treasury with all the regulation, you have risk with all the regulation. Okay, the way things evolved with banks, and I was talking with Simon the other day, somebody holds the budget and usually know nothing about technology, and they go and they ask for a new system. And they get it developed. So you have highly segregated silos here. They don't talk with each other. Yeah. So each of these domains were supposed to help you decide what you do with the money, what you do with the bank, and each of these domains gives you a different answer at the moment. And there is no innovation, there is no fintech, there is no discussion, there is no strategy. And these people, if you take any one of them, would not be able to tell you anything about the customers of the bank. And probably they have never been in a branch. So, if we talk about open banking and strategy and complexity, I would say that open banking is just the beginning of the modularization. Or Simon mentioned today in his slide, I think, componentization or something like that. Yeah, was it? So when this happens in an industry, this is not the first industry where this happens. When this happens, of course, you increase the number of options that you have, which is good. It brings also complexity. It could also bring innovation. And what I think will happen is that we will not see innovation or change or strategic transformation from inside these banks. We will see things appearing, components, pieces of functionality which are developed outside these institutions. And we will see really sub-industries being developed and things connecting in various possible ways. So it is already possible to see that. So I could identify components in each of these things. How this would look like. So you have here, for example, an application, a mobile app for students. One way of going in in open banking would be to go after a customer niche that you understand well and is underserved. Yeah. You find the company which offers transaction processing, which are usually technology companies, and you find the bank which offers capital, actually, and bank office services. So the communication between these would be the following. The bank, the ultimate capital provider, is interested in a certain risk profile, let's say students and certain type of products, and the partnerships is put together between these parts. Of course, I'm simplifying here because the bank will not be made out of all these components. But this is a scenario which exists nowadays, and it didn't exist 5 years ago.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So based upon this, is it fair to say that most banks don't understand their landscape? They don't understand their systems. If they do get disrupted, we know that someone will industrialize many of these custom-built components. It's not going to be a bank that actually does it. It's going to be somebody from outside the industry. And then they'll provide those component services which everybody else will build on top. So it's like Amazon repeating the game all over again, and they'll just take out that entire banking industry. And in fact, that's the only way to go forward. And what the banks, with all the inertia, are doing are just trying to obfuscate and play games and pretend we're open, when in fact it's just smoke and mirrors.
So discussing with banks about open, yeah.
So
The surprising thing here is in the area C, which you say the banks actually know nothing of, right?
No, they know, but...
All right, so the banks actually have the subject matter expertise within C.
Yes, they do.
Wouldn't they then be the best equipped to act as Amazon, because I kind of follow that analogy, to actually provide these services as services, since they have the expertise, if they had the thought, to capitalize then on what they today see as something private, something that only they own. But you know, if they could provide it as a service to the middle layer B or even A, they could actually build a business case around it.
So I will argue they can't see the environment and they have inertia. So if I go to Dave's point about the apex predator, it isn't going to be one of the banks.
I think there's another point related to this, and remember I made the point about acceptation. It's going to be repurposing which creates the next thing in an unexpected way. So the minute you ask a question about what's the right thing to do, you're asking the wrong sort of question. Yeah, you should be creating a space where there's more interaction between more things and spotting for novelty. I mean, one of the projects we're currently seeking funding for, because we now know how to do it, is how do you measure gifting? Yeah? Now this is not the same thing as barter. If you look at the way indigenous communities work, gifting is a membership fee, but it's not an equivalence fee. So it's not that you put money in and you draw it out, you put in services and that makes you part of the community. And service provision by individuals is unequal. Yeah? Now, one of the reasons we're looking at that is as you get increasing resource scarcity, we need alternative economic models, because the only economic model we've got for extreme scarcity of natural resources is a form of feudal fascism, yeah, in which ownership of the resource becomes the most important thing. So I think one of the things you're going to start to see is new experiments. You can see it with some of the experiments on minimum wage, which is just starting on the process, which are going to be, and to my mind, cities are going to be more important than countries over the next 10 years. Yeah? And cities are going to start to form new mechanisms for value, because using money as a rationing device for education and medicine, the only reason it's rationed is because we choose to use money as a mediating agency rather than looking at primary. So if you really want to get into this, you've got to start opening up the field far more extensively. Yeah? And you've got to start to actually look at radical repurposing at the right level of granularity and see what patterns emerge.
We'll just answer to your question, and I'll stop so we can have more questions and more discussion. So here, even in this modular world, here you will still have banks, because this is the essence of the bank. So if you are to reduce essence, actually, the capital management, the capital provider, that is the bank. Yeah. So for transaction processing, you can find. I mean, technology companies are much better at doing this at a fraction of a cost. And for creating propositions which really serve a market, that's a completely different set of skills. Yeah. And actually, in the digital world, people are used to have very individual needs being served. Banking is not there, and the fact that the inequality increases more and more. We have people, even in very developed countries, living in abject poverty, while their financial needs are completely different than others. The digital needs for banking of older population are also different. The digital needs of people with various disabilities are very different. And these things can be developed. It's not rocket science. It can be done, but not on these shaky premises. And for sure, it will not be a bank which will develop that. So there is a place for this type of specialization, and actually there is a need for that. I think the fact that open banking comes through regulation, it's a positive sign. It means that the regulator really wants to enable some competition or disaggregations of these monoliths.
For control, the
by bringing this to the regulation, might want to see it as a frightening situation, and then we wish to control it as well.
Control what?
Yeah, the open meeting.
Was that regulations?
I'm sorry to be doom and disaster, but I think you also need to look at some of the other stuff which is going on in parallel with this. One of the problems a lot of us have got with things like blockchain is it's more readily used by terrorists and by criminals than by governments. And the problem is most of the IT development in the valleys comes from people who haven't grown out of Ayn Rand. I mean, most people grow out of Ayn Rand before puberty. But for some reason, most of the Americans seem to take her seriously. So you've got this libertarian culture which doesn't believe in constraint, right? Now, I think that's deeply problematic. Some of the things we now know are going on is AI programs developed to improve people's mental health by giving them feedback which encourages them, and now being used to target political players to cause actual mental breakdown. Because we got enough data on you now, and if we can hack your medical records as well, we can basically target individuals at scale. Right? If you think that isn't going to happen with banking, and if you don't think it's going to happen with open banking, you're being tremendously naive, right? Basically, if you want a prediction, banking is about to become criminalized. Yeah, because it won't be possible for anybody else to fight it, because you haven't got enough human agency in the system. I'll come back to the buffering concept. That's why I think you're going to start to see cohesive cultural units, which is small countries and cities. It's not big countries. And in some cases, large corporations, which almost act like cities, are going to start to create service-based relationships, which are completely different from transaction-based relationships. And you can already see it in your relationship with things like Amazon and Netflix. The service relationship models have been worked out, and that's going to be radically different. And I don't see people looking at this stuff outside the context of national security, which ironically is one of the most innovative spaces I've ever worked in my life, because you're dealing with imminent, continuous, real threat. And therefore you see things in a very different way from the banks, who are largely immunized from the threat they're going to face until that threat becomes catastrophic.
So that actually goes back to what I was saying about self-driving cars becoming a commodity. We'll have digital subscription models. So there won't be a difference between the car that drives me or you, but there will be a difference in terms of the digital subscription service you have. And if you're a gold member or a platinum member and everybody else is silver, then when you get on the road, all the other self-driving cars will get out of the way for you. And that works, that's fine, but we've now embedded social inequality in the transportation system. And the problem is when we have an environmental disaster, all the rich people get out, all the poor people get flooded, and we have pitchforks the next day. So going back to these questions, blockchain, machine learning, future predictions, lots of terrible unintended consequences, it seems. Is that a fair statement? Yes? Anybody disagree with this, or anybody sort of cheering, it's a happy, wonderful future coming towards us? One. Right, the rest of us, dystopian nightmare. Okay, so the future is hell. Okay. Software.
You've created a false dichotomy.
Oh, am I?
Yeah. The danger is false optimism. It's not a dystopian utopianism. Utopianism is far more dangerous than dystopianism. Because if you are a dystopian, you're prepared to do something about it. It doesn't mean that you can't do something about it. But the reality is, if we don't actively do something, it is going to be that way.
So, the future is hell unless you get off your butts. There you are. And that's an entire talk, and that's an entire conference, I think. So that's a good one. Software data separation. I think we've had an examination into the banking world where we've discovered they can't even give a single figure for liquidity within a single bank, because you have three different treasury risk and financial accounts. You get three different figures for liquidity. It's probably one of the most...
Which is a physical...
You know, there are many abstract things in the world of finance, but liquidity, it's almost tangible, yeah? It's about money by period, yeah? That's the most difficult thing to obtain in banking, and actually you do have large differences between these domains, which all calculate liquidity. And the problem is that the bank acts at the level of its balance sheet on those numbers. Think about it when you go at night to sleep.
So that's basically... So I was going to say that's basically the future is hell. Again, actually, if we think about the banking systems. Sorry, was there a comment? Sorry, at the back.
I'm quite loud. Is this still valid for new banks? So, for example, there's like in the UK, Monzo. Is a brand new bank. Will they be able to change the market?
Yeah. Challenger banks have a completely different situation in UK. So they have this stack with newer technology, it's true, but they are for the moment guarded from the heaviness of regulation. So the consequence, they have a much simpler stack. If they were required, like if they would go, I don't know, through a long period, like 20 years, if they would go through expansion, global expansion or acquisitions or things like that, they will end up with the same problem. So mainly they are guarded at the moment from regulation. They don't have to comply with all the regulation. They don't have mortgages, they don't have loans, they just have current accounts and a very small proportion of the market. I do hope that they will have more and they will be successful, but they simply don't have the same problems as the big banks at the moment.
It's quite interesting to see what's happening with Airbnb at the moment. Yeah? And it's actually a social pressure thing, because basically if I look at where I come from in Wales, right, Airbnb is taking a second equivalent of the English second home problem. Yeah? In that the fact that Airbnb allows people to buy to rent is increasing prices, so people from the area can't buy in. Bed and breakfasts, which are a core part of a tourist community, are going under because they actually satisfy the regulations. So now if you go into an Airbnb in those areas, and I just went into one in Toronto, with a please don't tell anybody I've rented this. Because increasingly the regulation thing it's slow to catch up, but it's starting to come in and it's starting to structure it. And it's also starting, it doesn't increase the economy, it decreases traditional sides of the economy. Yeah? The same issue with Uber. If you look at Uber, is now being hit in many cities. Yeah? Because people are starting to realise the political implications of what happens if you continue it. And just look at the net. The net is still based on a limited number of trunks, and guys, we know where they are, and we've got submarines. All right? Yeah, the idea you're in this totally free environment, governments, if they need to, can basically clamp everything down. All right? And it's going to happen at some stage, unless you create a different way of actually having that power.
Okay, so this leads us now into, so in terms of software data separation, again, lots of unintended consequences and things going on in this space. The future is hell, Mark II, and anthropology. Why can't we get jobs? So the impression that I got was it's really important that we employ more anthropologists, because these are complex social systems. You disagree with me?
Okay, let me get blunt at this. I mean, when I was at school, I had mastered two brilliant things. One is, one appalling thing, one brilliant thing. He made us learn how to use punch card machines. Because he said if we did that, we'd have a job for life. Yeah? He also made us do RSA Stage 3 typing. Now, we're an elite grammar school, largely male, all right? Yeah, typing is something done by stupid girls in the secondary modern because they want to be secretary. Sorry, this is 1972. Yeah, so we were appalled. It was the best thing he ever did. Yeah, typing was a skill at a level of granularity which proved very useful, whereas punch cards won't. Anything we teach a kid in school at the moment about technology will be out of date by the time they graduate. Yeah? There is absolutely no point in teaching them to code, because anything we can teach them now, and actually our teachers aren't good enough because if they were that bloody good, they'd be out doing startups. Yeah? What we're not actually doing is we're not teaching them about people, about social interactions, about history, which actually are skills which continue thereafter. I remember saying to my son, if you want to do computer science at university, you better be bloody good, because if you're not in a management position, by your late 20s, somebody younger will replace you, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So to my mind, the humanities are the important things to teach. The technology people can pick up later, right? And I think that also means we're starting to see a recognition that amateur people on culture, and there are so many consultants who will sell you culture maps and culture interventions, yeah, and they'll tell you they do ethnography because they've learned to go and interview people and they've looked up ethnography in Wikipedia and they think it's the same thing, right? That if you actually go and start to employ anthropologists, which we've seen a lot now in HR in the States and in the medical profession, and in design, right? They know about culture, and critically, they're paranoid about power. The one thing, if you ever meet an anthropologist, and my daughter's got a master's degree at the moment and is writing critical essays about my misuse of Deleuze, all right? It's scary when daughters do that, is they actually understand power and the implications of power in a way that most people in HR don't, and that's why they're having big take-up in the medical profession at the moment. So future employability is not going to be about technical skills, it's going to be about human skills.
So basically we're training the wrong things at the moment. So number 3 is the future is hell. We are training the wrong things at the moment. It is solvable though, which is good. Question 4 was, does Mr. Snowden have lots of experience? One solitary yes. Come on. Yes, right. Secrets of success, startups versus large corporations. I think we covered the whole issue of inertia, apex predator, first mover, different games they can play. We all knew. Well, we all knew, for example, you had all those big companies, IBM, HP, Dell, they were on the top of the hill with the tanks and all the money and everything else, and down at the bottom of the valley was a lone chap, Bezos, with a sling, and then he took them all out, so he now has all the tanks and all the planes, and he's at the top of the hill, and of course they're all saying, yes, we're going to beat him now, which of course is nonsense. So there's a whole new set of games and other bits and pieces. You get the new startups coming into these more commoditized industries. Are there secrets of success? I think there's some generally university useful lessons, but there's also an awful lot of context-specific play, and you have to understand the context. That would be my take.
I think it's also respect the literature. I mean, one of my other big objections on the startup, yeah, is it's basically it misunderstands context. In a market, a certain percentage will succeed. And there's a whole literature on what's called intrapreneurship. Yeah, Mac down at Pennsylvania and elsewhere, which actually says entrepreneurship in a large company is radically different from a market, because you haven't got the tolerance for failure, you've got limited resource. So there's 30 years of sound research with examples there. But we're currently surging into, effectively, what people want is a simplistic recipe, popularly sold, which allows them to go down an adoption curve and pretend they're doing something, right? And that, if you look at the literature, is called lotus eating.
I've just brought 2x2 just in case.
Yeah, and the lotus eating scares me because everybody is retreating into a series of simplistic initiatives rather than deal with the real problems. And that's what will kill us. What will kill us is the popular management science books and nonsense like Jade organisations and all of that sort of crap, which is based on appalling research, with people with theories looking for cases to justify a theory to sell a consultancy method. And it's appalling. It's a commodification of meaning.
You don't want to add a little bit more about the death of banks in there? Okay, so the next one is DDD, 90% business, but should be 90% business, but is 90% IT. We didn't even get to that one, did we? How do we fix that one?
I don't have a solution. I can I can just comment because I have been on both parts. I have been in IT and I have been in business. I don't have frameworks. I just think that individually we should ignore the borders, in the organization. And for example, you are in the IT part of a bank. You just go and meet those people you will develop the system from. So you just don't work with, over the fence and so on. Just move in the organization, go meet people, make connections and so on. This at times work for me. What I truly hated, because it's also, the walls are very high, and I'm aware, and sometimes even when you sell into a bank, you can sell only to IT, or you can sell only to business, even if for bloody one time they should be together and make a decision, because it's about all of them. Yeah.
I disagree. I actually think boundaries are critical. Yeah, human beings don't cope well without boundaries. Yeah, if you actually create boundaries, people know on one side of the fence you behave like this, on the other side of the fence you face like that. And effectively, human systems are more resilient if they're heterogeneous rather than they're homogeneous. Yeah? And we're about to announce an initiative, I think, in about 4 weeks' time. This is kind of like in one of the sort of pre-Scrum things we're now developing on Agile. I have to be careful what I say because we're forming companies around this. In which we're going to create a new role in which we train users to talk to IT people. Because the reality is, training IT people to understand users is virtually impossible. Because they haven't got any of the experience necessary to understand it, all right? If they're any good at IT, they've been in technology all their life, all right? We won't talk about the misogynism within the IT community because it's still one of the worst in most departments, all right, in terms of the way it works. They haven't got the broad experience to understand the context in which people are even asking questions. But you can train users to communicate better to IT people, and I'm being really tongue-in-cheek here, but we've actually discovered how to short-circuit on this by radical repurposing. We're taking material for adults who discover they've got an autistic child, and we're repurposing it. Yeah, because actually, and this is cognitive diversity, there's a high degree of Asperger's syndrome in the IT community because it's a positive advantage. Like there's a high degree of dyslexia in marketing because it's a positive advantage. These so-called educational deficiencies are not deficiencies, they're capabilities, yeah, in a distributed system. But it means, I think, you need to understand where things sit and you have to have protocols for the exchange between it. And you have to think about what's the easiest mechanism for training. To get somebody with a huge amount of experience to explain things in a structured way is a lot easier than to get people with structured experience to understand the diversity, yeah, of business. We might now have got to an argument, which will be
No, it's not an argument. It just happened that I personally experienced more pain when I was in business or dealing with business people. Maybe I'm autistic, I have no idea. I think maybe you have a proposal for this, but that there should be more respect on both sides for the type of knowledge and experience.
That's the point about boundaries. If you have boundaries, you can have respect. Yeah. So if you it's the way a team works or a crew works. There are boundaries. Yeah. So a navigator will not interfere with a pilot because they know if they do, the plane will fly less effectively. And people were arguing at the FAA. I mean, I was one of the witnesses on this, and said that sometimes we should interfere because the pilot crashes. And all the pilots and all the navigators basically said yes. But more times than not, we'd actually crash because of the lack of consensus, because of the lack of boundaries. Respect comes through boundaries and understanding protocols, not through just let's all be nice to each other and have a happy clappy session and talk with each other. That doesn't work.
So, just conscious also of the time, because we have to get people out, but just to add on to that point, so for example, you can get soldiers working with the army working with the Air Force, we can communicate with each other. You don't get a soldier asking for air support and a pilot saying, well, do you know how to fly a plane? And the soldier going, no, well, I can't give you air support then. You've got to go. So we can actually communicate, as long as we have a common mechanism of communication, which, by the way, they use is a map. But but of course that was coming along. Cinnamon, contribute to maps, strategic choices. Obviously, a lot of overlap between the whole apex predator theory and also how the area that I use mapping. I mean, I find them both very complementary. So the next one, where do I store my money? Not in a bank, apparently. Give it to your friends and build your own network, is from what I understand there. Who should we listen to? Definitely not management consultants, if you ask me. And those writing generalised sort of management books. Anybody else we want to? And well, it sounds like there's a people supporting Brexit, but I quite like Brexit. But anyway, so better not talk about that one. Yeah, absolutely. So.
You never know who they are.
Yes. So mapping, helpful but not trivial. Well, I try to explain a bit of mapping. Yes, it is can be helpful and it is not trivial. Sorry about that. I'd love to write a really fast guide to mapping, or no, more importantly, I'd love to read a really fast guide to mapping. So if anybody wants to write that, I would be really appreciate that. Disparity of reality and design. I think the open banking, the banking is the best example of this. We have this sort of belief that banks are well organised, well structured, but the reality is truly horrendous, isn't it? Yes. Okay. Right. So that we've done that one. Motivations. We talked about. Well, I talked about mine, and Dave, did you add in your motivation? Of life? Okay. Survive. Okay, excellent. How to use DDD in a process industry. I didn't think did we get to that one?
No idea.
No idea, no idea. Do you have an idea? Anybody here have an idea? Anyone?
Disrupt the industry.
Now, how to use domain-driven design in a regulated industry. Anybody got an idea? No one? Okay.
The fact that the industry is regulated doesn't change the method, it just imposes some constraints of what you can and you cannot do in a particular domain. In banking, you have probably 100 regulators applicable to the bank. People always refer to the regulator. There are 100, but rules, there are rules and which define the design.
We have approximately 30 seconds left, so maps. Okay, this teaches me to have better handwriting, because it says maps on verb level, what should something concentrate on? I can't remember that question. If you asked it, come and grab me later. And the last one, should banks be worried about open banking? Yes, except that they're going to use regulators to protect themselves as long as possible until somebody comes into this industry and actually starts to disrupt it for real. And at that point, go for coffee. Thank you very much.